Happy Monday. I hope you had a great weekend, all of you. Last Friday, we started Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, so go back and listen to those first 25 pages if you haven't yet. And we're just gonna get going. Let's go, Harry Potter. So, we're starting in chapter 3, The Invitation. By the time Harry arrived in the kitchen, the three Dursleys were already seated around the table. None of them looked up as he entered or sat down. Uncle Vernon's large red face was hidden behind the morning's Daily Mail, and Aunt Petunia was cutting a grapefruit into quarters, her lips pursed over her horse-like teeth. Dudley looked furious and sulky, and somehow seemed to be taking up even more space than usual. This was saying something, as he always took up an entire side of the square table by himself. When Aunt Petunia put a quarter of unsweetened grapefruit onto Dudley's plate with a tremulous, "There you are, Diddy darling," Dudley glowered at her. His life had taken a most unpleasant turn since he had come home for the summer with his end-of-year report. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia had managed to find excuses for his bad marks as usual. Aunt Petunia always insisted that Dudley was a very gifted boy whose teachers didn't understand him, while Uncle Vernon maintained that he didn't want some swotty little Nancy boy for a son anyway. They also skated over the accusations of bullying in the report. "He's a boisterous little boy, but he wouldn't hurt a fly," Aunt Petunia had said tearfully. However, at the bottom of the report, there were a few well-chosen comments from the school nurse that not even Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia could explain away. No matter how much Aunt Petunia wailed that Dudley was big-boned, and that his poundage was really puppy fat, and that he was a growing boy who needed plenty of food, the fact remained that the school outfitters didn't stock knickerbockers big enough for him anymore. The school nurse had seen one Aunt Petunia's eyes, so sharp when it came to spotting fingerprints on her gleaming walls and in observing the comings and goings of the neighbors, simply refused to see that far from needing extra nourishment, Dudley had reached roughly the size and weight of a young killer whale. So, after many tantrums, after arguments that shook Harry's bedroom floor, and many tears from Aunt Petunia, the new regime had begun. The diet sheet that had been sent by the smelting school nurse had been taped to the fridge, which had been emptied of all of Dudley's favorite things, fizzy drinks and cakes, chocolate bars and burgers, and filled instead with fruit and vegetables and the sort of things that Uncle Vernon called rabbit food. To make Dudley feel better about it all, Aunt Petunia had insisted that the whole family follow the diet too. She now passed a grapefruit quarter to Harry. He noticed that it was a lot smaller than Dudley's. Aunt Petunia seemed to feel that the best way to keep up Dudley's morale was to make sure that he did, at least, get more to eat than Harry. But Aunt Petunia didn't know what was hidden under the loose floorboard upstairs. She had no idea that Harry was not following the diet at all. The moment he had got wind of the fact that he was expected to survive the summer on carrot sticks, Harry had sent Hedwig to his friends with pleas for help, and they had risen to the occasion magnificently. Hedwig had returned from Hermione's house with a large box stuffed full of sugar-free snacks. Hermione's parents were dentists. Hagrid, the Hogwarts gamekeeper, had obliged with a sack full of his own homemade rock cakes. Harry hadn't touched these. He had had too much experience of Hagrid's cooking. Mrs. Weasley, however, had sent the family owl, Errol, with an enormous fruitcake and assorted meat pies. Poor Errol, who was elderly and feeble, had needed a full 5 days to recover from the journey. And then, on Harry's birthday, which the Dursleys had completely ignored, he had received 4 superb birthday cakes, one each from Ron, Hermione, Hagrid, and Sirius. Harry still had 2 of them left, and so, looking forward to a real breakfast when he got back upstairs, he ate his grapefruit without complaint. Uncle Vernon laid aside his paper with a deep sniff of disapproval and looked down at his own grapefruit quarter. "Is this it?" he said grumpily to Aunt Petunia. Aunt Petunia gave him a severe look, and then nodded pointedly at Dudley, who had already finished his own grapefruit quarter and was eyeing Harry's with a very sour look in his piggy little eyes. Uncle Vernon gave a great sigh, which ruffled his large, bushy mustache, and picked up his spoon. The doorbell rang. Uncle Vernon heaved himself out of his chair and sat down off the hall. Quick as a flash, while his mother was occupied with the kettle, Dudley stole the rest of Uncle Vernon's grapefruit. Harry heard talking at the door and someone laughing, and Uncle Vernon answering curtly. Then the front door closed, and the sound of ripping paper came from the hall. Aunt Petunia set the teapot down on the table and looked curiously around to see where Uncle Vernon had got to. She didn't have to wait long to find out. After about a minute, he was back. He looked livid. "You!" he barked at Harry. "In the living room, now!" Bewildered, wondering what on earth he was supposed to have done this time, Harry got up and followed Uncle Vernon out of the kitchen and into the next room. Uncle Vernon closed the door sharply behind both of them. "So," he said, marching over to the fireplace and turning to face Harry as though he were about to pronounce him under arrest. "So." Harry would have dearly loved to have said, "So what?" But he didn't feel that Uncle Vernon's temper should be tested this early in the morning, especially when it was already under severe strain from lack of food. He therefore settled for looking politely puzzled. "This just arrived," said Uncle Vernon. He brandished a piece of purple writing paper at Harry. "A letter about you." Harry's confusion increased. Who would be writing to Uncle Vernon about him? Who did he know who sent letters by the postman? Uncle Vernon glared at Harry, then looked down at the letter and began to read aloud. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, we have never been introduced, but I am sure you have heard a great deal from Harry about my son Ron. As Harry might have told you, the final of the Quidditch World Cup takes place this Monday night, and my husband, Arthur, has just managed to get prime tickets through his connections at the Department of Magical Games and Sports. I do hope you will allow us to take Harry to the match, as this really is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Britain hasn't hosted the Cup for 30 years, and tickets are extremely hard to come by. We would of course be glad to have Harry stay for the remainder of the summer holidays, and to see him safely onto the train back to school. It would be best for Harry to send us your answer as quickly as possible in the normal way, because the Muggle postman has never delivered to our house, and I am not sure he even knows where it is. Hoping to see Harry soon. Yours sincerely, Molly Weasley. P.S. I do hope we've put enough stamps on." Uncle Vernon finished reading, put his hand back into his breast pocket, and drew out something else. "Look at this," he growled. He held up the envelope in which Mrs. Weasley's letter had come, and Harry had to fight down a laugh. Every bit of it was covered in stamps except for a square inch on the front, into which Mrs. Weasley had squeezed the Dursleys' address in minute writing. "She did put enough stamps on then," said Harry, trying to sound as though Mrs. Weasley's was a mistake anyone could make. His uncle's eyes flashed. "The postman noticed," he said through gritted teeth. "Very interested to know where this letter came from, he was. That's why he rang the doorbell. Seemed to think it was funny." Harry didn't say anything. Other people might not understand why Uncle Vernon was making a fuss about too many stamps, but Harry had lived with the Dursleys too long not to know how touchy they were about anything even slightly out of the ordinary. Their worst fear was that someone would find out that they were connected, however distantly, with people like Mrs. Weasley. Uncle Vernon was still glaring at Harry, who tried to keep his expression neutral. If he didn't do or say anything stupid, he might just be in for the treat of a lifetime. He waited for Uncle Vernon to say something, but he merely continued to glare. Harry decided to break the silence. "So, can I go then?" he asked. A slight spasm crossed Uncle Vernon's large purple face. The mustache bristled. Harry thought he knew what was going on behind the mustache. A furious battle as two of Uncle Vernon's most fundamental instincts came into conflict. Allowing Harry to go would make Harry happy, something Uncle Vernon had struggled against for 13 years. On the other hand, allowing Harry to disappear to the Weasleys for the rest of the summer would get rid of him 2 weeks earlier than anyone could have hoped, and Uncle Vernon hated having Harry in the house. To give himself thinking time, it seemed, he looked down at Mrs. Weasley's letter again. "Who is this woman?" he said, staring at the signature with distaste. "You've seen her," said Harry. "She's my friend Ron's mother. She was meeting him off the school train at the end of last term." He'd almost said Hogwarts Express, and that was a sure way to get his uncle's temper up. Nobody ever mentioned the name of Harry's school aloud in the Dursley household. Uncle Vernon screwed up his enormous face as though trying to remember something very unpleasant. "Dumpy sort of woman?" he growled finally. "Load of children with red hair?" Harry frowned. He thought it was a bit rich of Uncle Vernon to call anyone dumpy, when his own son, Dudley, had finally achieved what he'd been threatening to do since the age of 3 and become wider than he was tall. Uncle Vernon was perusing the letter again. "Quidditch," he muttered under his breath. "Quidditch! What is this rubbish?" Harry felt a second stab of annoyance. "It's a sport," he said shortly. "Played on a broom." All right, said Uncle Vernon loudly. Harry saw with some satisfaction that his uncle looked vaguely panicky. Apparently his nerves couldn't stand the sound of the word broomsticks in his living room. He took refuge in perusing the letter again. Harry saw his lips form the words, "Send us your answer, in the normal way." He scowled. "What does she mean, the normal way?" he spat. "Normal for us," said Harry, and before his uncle could stop him, he added, "You know, owl post. That's what's normal for wizards." Uncle Vernon looked as outraged as if Harry had just uttered a disgusting swear word. Shaking with anger, He shot a nervous look through the window, as though expecting to see some of the neighbors with their ears pressed against the glass. "How many times do I have to tell you not to mention that unnaturalness under my roof?" he hissed, his face now a rich plum color. "You stand there in the clothes Petunia and I have put on your ungrateful back." "Only after Dudley finished with them," said Harry coldly, and indeed, he was dressed in a sweatshirt so large for him that he had to roll back the sleeves 5 times so as to be able to use his hands, and which fell past the knees of his extremely baggy jeans. "I will not be spoken to like that," said Uncle Vernon, trembling with rage. But Harry wasn't going to stand for this. Gone were the days when he had been forced to take every single one of the Dursleys' stupid rules. He wasn't following Dudley's diet, and he wasn't going to let Uncle Vernon stop him from going to the Quidditch World Cup. Not if he could help it. Harry took a deep, steadying breath and then said, "Okay, I can't see the World Cup. Can I go now then? Only I've got a letter to Sirius I want to finish. You know, my godfather." He had done it. He had said the magic words. Now he watched the purple recede blotchily from Uncle Vernon's face, making it look like badly mixed black currant ice cream. You're writing to him, are you?" said Uncle Vernon in a would-be calm voice. But Harry had seen the pupils of his tiny eyes contract with sudden fear. "Well, yeah," said Harry casually. "It's been a while since he heard from me, and if he doesn't, he might start thinking something's wrong." He stopped there to enjoy the effect of these words. He could almost see the cogs working under Uncle Vernon's thick, dark, neatly parted hair. If he tried to stop Harry writing to Sirius, Sirius would think Harry was being mistreated. If he told Harry he couldn't go to the Quidditch World Cup, Harry would write and tell Sirius, who would know Harry was being mistreated. There was only one thing for Uncle Vernon to do. Harry could see the conclusion forming in his uncle's mind, as though the great mustached face were transparent. Harry tried not to smile, to keep his own face as blank as possible, and then, "Well, all right then. You can go to this World Cup thing. You write and tell these Weasleys. They're to pick you up, mind. I haven't got time to go dropping you off all over the country. You can spend the rest of your summer there, and you can tell your godfather. Tell him you're going." "Okay then," said Harry brightly. He turned and walked toward the living room door, fighting the urge to jump into the air and whoop. He was going. He was going to the Weasleys. He was going to watch the Quidditch World Cup. Outside in the hall, he nearly ran into Dudley, who'd been lurking behind the door, clearly hoping to overhear Harry being told off. He looked shocked to see the broad grin on Harry's face. "That was an excellent breakfast, wasn't it?" said Harry. "I feel really full, don't you?" Laughing at the astonished look on Dudley's face, Harry took the stairs 3 at a time and hurled himself back into his bedroom. The first thing he saw was that Hedwig was back. She was sitting in her cage, staring at Harry with her enormous amber eyes and clicking her beak in the way that meant she was annoyed about something. Exactly what was annoying her became apparent almost at once. "Ouch!" said Harry, as what appeared to be a small, gray, feathery tennis ball collided with the side of his head. Harry massaged the spot furiously, looking up to see what had hit him, and saw a minute owl, small enough to fit into the palm of his hand, whizzing excitedly around the room like a loose firework. Harry then realized the owl had dropped a letter at his feet. Harry bent down, recognized Ron's handwriting, then tore open the envelope. Inside was a hastily scribbled note. "Harry, Dad got the tickets. Ireland versus Bulgaria, Monday night. Mum's writing to the Muggles to ask you to stay. They might already have the letter. I don't know how fast Muggle Post is. Thought I'd send this with Pig anyway." Harry stared at the word Pig, then looked up at the tiny owl now zooming around the light fixture on the ceiling. He had never seen anything that looked less like a pig. Maybe he couldn't read Ron's writing. He went back to the letter. "We're coming for you whether the Muggles like it or not. You can't miss the World Cup, only Mum and Dad reckon it's better if we pretend to ask their permission first. If they say yes, send Pig back with your answer pronto and we'll come and get you at 5 o'clock on Sunday. If they say no, send Pig back pronto and we'll come and get you at 5 o'clock on Sunday anyway. Hermione's arriving this afternoon. Percy started work. The Department of International Magical Cooperation. Don't mention anything about abroad while you're here unless you want the pants bored off you. See you soon, Ron." "Calm down," Harry said as the small owl flew low over his head, twittering madly with what Harry could only assume was pride at having delivered the letter to the right person. "Come here, I need you to take my answer back." The owl fluttered down on top of Hedwig's cage. Hedwig looked coldly up at it, as though daring it to try and come any closer. Harry seized his eagle feather quirl once more, grabbed a fresh piece of parchment, and wrote, "Ron, it's all okay. The Muggles say I can come. See you 5 o'clock tomorrow. Can't wait, Harry." He folded this note up very small, and with immense difficulty, tied it to the tiny owl's leg as it hopped on the spot with excitement. The moment the note was secure, the owl was off again. It zoomed out of the window and out of sight. Harry turned to Hedwig. "Feeling up to a long journey?" he asked her. Hedwig hooted in a dignified sort of way. "Can you take this to Sirius for me?" he said, picking up his letter. "Hang on, I just want to finish it." He unfolded the parchment and hastily added a postscript. "If you want to contact me, I'll be at my friend Ron Weasley's for the rest of the summer. His dad's got us tickets for the Quidditch World Cup." The letter finished, he tied it to Hedwig's leg. She kept unusually still, as though determined to show him how a real post owl should behave. "I'll be at Ron's when you get back, all right?" Harry told her. She nipped his finger affectionately, then, with a soft swooshing noise, spread her enormous wings and soared out of the open window. Harry watched her out of sight, then crawled under his bed, wrenched up the loose floorboard, and pulled out a large chunk of birthday cake. He sat there on the floor, eating it, savoring the happiness that was flooding through him. He had cake, and Dudley had nothing but grapefruit. It was a bright summer's day. He would be leaving Privet Drive tomorrow. His scar felt perfectly normal again, and he was going to watch the Quidditch World Cup. It was hard, just now, to feel worried about anything, even Lord Voldemort. Chapter 4. Back to the Burrow. By 12 o'clock the next day, Harry's school trunk was packed with his school things and all his most prized possessions: the invisibility cloak he had inherited from his father, the broomstick he'd gotten from Sirius, the enchanted map of Hogwarts he'd been given by Fred and George Weasley last year. He'd emptied his hiding place under the loose floorboard of all food, double-checked every nook and cranny of his bedroom for forgotten spellbooks or quills, and taken down the chart on the wall counting down the days to September the 1st, on which he liked to cross off the days remaining until his return to Hogwarts. The atmosphere inside number 4 Privet Drive was extremely tense. The imminent arrival at their house of an assortment of wizards was making the Dursleys uptight and irritable. Uncle Vernon had looked downright alarmed when Harry informed him that the Weasleys would be arriving at 5 o'clock the very next day. "I hope you told them to dress properly, these people," he snarled at once. "I've seen the sort of stuff your lot wear. They'd better have the decency to put on normal clothes, that's all." Harry felt a slight sense of foreboding. He had rarely seen Mr. or Mrs. Weasley wearing anything that the Dursleys would call normal. Their children might don Muggle clothing during the holidays, but Mr. and Mrs. Weasley usually wore long robes and varying states of shabbiness. Harry wasn't bothered about what the neighbors would think, but he was anxious about how rude the Dursleys might be to the Weasleys if they turned up looking like their worst idea of wizards. Uncle Vernon had put on his best suit. To some people, this might have looked like a gesture of welcome, but Harry knew it was because Uncle Vernon wanted to look impressive and intimidating. Dudley, on the other hand, looked somehow diminished. It was not because the diet was at last taking effect, but due to fright. Dudley had emerged from his last encounter with a fully grown wizard, with a curly pig's tail poking out of the seat of his trousers, and Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon had had to pay for its removal at a private hospital in London. It wasn't altogether surprising, therefore, that Dudley kept running his hand nervously over his backside and walking sideways from room to room so as not to present the same target to the enemy. Lunch was an almost silent meal. Dudley didn't even protest at the food: cottage cheese and grated celery. Aunt Petunia wasn't eating anything at all. Her arms were folded. Her lips were pursed, and she seemed to be chewing her tongue, as though biting back the furious diatribe she longed to throw at Harry. "They'll be driving, of course," Uncle Vernon barked across the table. Said Harry. He hadn't thought of that. How were the Weasleys going to pick him up? They didn't have a car anymore. The old Ford Anglia they had once owned was currently running wild in the Forbidden Forest at Hogwarts. But Mr. Weasley had borrowed a Ministry of Magic car last year. Possibly he would do the same today? "I think so," said Harry. Uncle Vernon snorted into his mustache. Normally, Uncle Vernon would have asked what car Mr. Weasley drove. He tended to judge other men by how big and expensive their cars were. But Harry doubted whether Uncle Vernon would have taken to Mr. Weasley even if he drove a Ferrari. Harry spent most of the afternoon in his bedroom. He couldn't stand watching Aunt Petunia peer out through the net curtains every few seconds, as though there had been a warning about an escaped rhinoceros. Finally, at 5:15, Harry went back downstairs and into the living room. Aunt Petunia was compulsively straightening cushions. Uncle Vernon was pretending to read the paper, but his tiny eyes were not moving, and Harry was sure he was really listening with all his might for the sound of an approaching car. Dudley was crammed into an armchair, his porky hands beneath him, clamped firmly around his bottom. Harry couldn't take the tension. He left the room and went and sat on the stairs in the hall, his eyes on his watch and his heart pumping fast from excitement and nerves. But 5 o'clock came and then went. Uncle Vernon, perspiring slightly in his suit, opened the front door, peered up and down the street, then withdrew his head quickly. "They're late," he snarled at Harry. "I know," said Harry. "Maybe, the traffic's bad or something." 5:10, then 5:15. Harry was starting to feel anxious himself now. At 5:30, he heard Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia conversing in terse mutters in the living room. "No consideration at all. We might have had an engagement. Maybe they think they'll get invited to dinner if they're late." "Well, they most certainly won't be," said Uncle Vernon, and Harry heard him stand up and start pacing the living room. "They'll take the boy and go. There'll be no hanging around. That's if they're coming at all. Probably mistaken the day. I dare say their kind don't set much store by punctuality. Either that or they drive some tin pot car that's broken down." Ah! Harry jumped up. From the other side of the living room door came the sounds of the three Dursleys scrambling, panic-stricken across the room. Next moment, Dudley came flying into the hall, looking terrified. "What happened?" said Harry. "What's the matter?" But Dudley didn't seem able to speak. Hands still clamped over his buttocks, he waddled as fast as he could into the kitchen. Harry hurried into the living room. Loud bangings and scrapings were coming from behind the Dursleys' boarded-up fireplace, which had a fake coal fire plugged in front of it. "What is it?" gasped Aunt Petunia, who had backed into the wall and was staring terrified toward the fire. "What is it, Vernon?" But they were left in doubt barely a second longer. Voices could be heard from inside the blocked fireplace. "Ouch! Fred, no! Go back, go back! There's been some kind of mistake. Tell George not to— Ouch! George, no, there's no room. Go back quickly and tell Ron. Maybe Harry can hear us, Dad. Maybe he'll be able to let us out." There was a loud hammering of fists on the boards behind the electric fire. Harry, can you hear us?" The Dursleys rounded on Harry like a pair of angry wolverines. "What is this?" growled Uncle Vernon. "What's going on?" They've tried to get here by flue powder," said Harry, fighting a mad desire to laugh. "They can travel by fire, only you've blocked the fireplace. Hang on." He approached the fireplace and called through the boards. "Mr. Weasley, can you hear me?" The hammering stopped. Somebody inside the chimney piece said, "Shh!" "Mr. Weasley, it's Harry. The fireplace has been blocked up. You won't be able to get through here." "Damn," said Mr. Weasley's voice. "What on earth did they want to block up the fireplace for?" "They've got an electric fire," Harry explained. "Really?" said Mr. Weasley's voice excitedly. "Eclectic, you say? With a plug? Gracious, I must see that. Let's think. Ouch, Ron!" Ron's voice now joined the others. "What are we doing here? Has something gone wrong?" "Oh, no, Ron," came Fred's voice very sarcastically. "No, this is exactly where we wanted to end up." "Yeah, we're having the time of our lives here," said George, whose voice sounded muffled, as though he was squashed against the wall. Boys, said Mr. Weasley vaguely, trying to think what to do. "Yes, only way. Stand back, Harry." Harry retreated to the sofa. Uncle Vernon, however, moved forward. "Wait a moment," he bellowed at the fire. "What exactly are you going to—" Bang! The electric fire shot across the room as the boarded-up fireplace burst outward, expelling Mr. Weasley, Fred, George, and Ron in a cloud of rubble and loose chippings. Aunt Petunia shrieked and fell backward over the coffee table. Uncle Vernon caught her before she hit the floor and gaped, speechless, at the Weasleys, all of whom had bright red hair, including Fred and George, who were identical to the last freckle. "That's better," panted Mr. Weasley, brushing dust from his long green robes and straightening his glasses. "Ah, you must be Harry's aunt and uncle." Tall, thin, and balding, he moved toward Uncle Vernon, his hand outstretched. But Uncle Vernon backed away several paces, dragging Aunt Petunia. Words utterly failed Uncle Vernon. His best suit was covered in white dust, which had settled in his hair and mustache, and made him look as though he had just aged 30 years. Yes, sorry about that," said Mr. Weasley, lowering his hand and looking over his shoulder at the blasted fireplace. "It's all my fault. It just didn't occur to me that we wouldn't be able to get out at the other end. I had your fireplace connected to the flue network, you see. Just for an afternoon, so we could get Harry. Muggle fireplaces aren't supposed to be connected, strictly speaking. But I've got a useful contact at the flue regulation panel, and he fixed it for me. I can put it back in a jiffy, though, don't worry. I'll light a fire to send the boys back, and then I can repair your fireplace before I disapparate." Harry was ready to bet that the Dursleys hadn't understood a single word of this. They were still gaping at Mr. Weasley, thunderstruck. Aunt Petunia staggered upright again and hid behind Uncle Vernon. "Hello, Harry," said Mr. Weasley brightly. Got your trunk ready? It's upstairs, said Harry, grinning back. We'll get it, said Fred at once. Winking at Harry, he and George left the room. They knew where Harry's bedroom was, having once rescued him from it in the dead of night. Harry suspected that Fred and George were hoping for a glimpse of Dudley. They had heard a lot about him from Harry. Well, said Mr. Weasley, swinging his arms slightly, while he tried to find words to break the very nasty silence. Very nice place you've got here. As the usually spotless living room was now covered in dust and bits of brick, this remark didn't go down too well with the Dursleys. Uncle Vernon's face purpled once more, and Aunt Petunia started chewing her tongue again. However, they seemed too scared to actually say anything. Mr. Weasley was looking around. He loved everything to do with Muggles. Harry could see him itching to go and examine the television and the video recorder. They run off electricity, do they? He said knowledgeably. Ha, yes, I can see the plugs. I collect plugs, he added to Uncle Vernon. And batteries. Got a very large collection of batteries. My wife thinks I'm mad, but there you are. Uncle Vernon clearly thought Mr. Weasley was mad too. He moved ever so slightly to the right, screening out Petunia from view as though he thought Mr. Weasley might suddenly run at them and attack. Dudley suddenly reappeared in the room. Harry could hear the clunk of his trunk on the stairs and knew that the sounds had scared Dudley out of the kitchen. Dudley edged along the wall, gazing at Mr. Weasley with terrified eyes, and attempted to conceal himself behind his mother and father. Unfortunately, Uncle Vernon's bulk, while sufficient to hide bony Aunt Petunia, was nowhere near enough to conceal Dudley. Ah, this is your cousin, is it, Harry? Said Mr. Weasley, taking another brave stab at making conversation. Yep, said Harry. That's Dudley. He and Ron exchanged glances and then quickly looked away from each other. The temptation to burst out laughing was almost overwhelming. Dudley was still clutching his bottom as though afraid it might fall off. Mr. Weasley, however, seemed genuinely concerned at Dudley's peculiar behavior. Indeed, from the tone of his voice when he next spoke, Harry was quite sure that Mr. Weasley thought Dudley was quite as mad as the Dursleys thought he was, except that Mr. Weasley felt sympathy rather than fear. Having a good holiday, Dudley? He said kindly. Dudley whimpered. Harry saw his hands tighten still harder over his massive backside. Fred and George came back into the room, carrying Harry's school trunk. They glanced around as they entered and spotted Dudley. Their faces cracked into identical evil grins. Ah, right, said Mr. Weasley. Better get cracking then. He pushed up the sleeves of his robe, took out his wand. Harry saw the Dursleys draw back against the wall as one. Incendio, said Mr. Weasley, pointing his wand at the hole in the wall behind him. Flames rose at once in the fireplace, crackling merrily as though they had been burning for hours. Mr. Weasley took a small drawstring bag from his pocket, untied it, took a pinch of the powder inside, and threw it into the flames, which turned emerald green and roared higher than ever. Off you go then, Fred, said Mr. Weasley. Coming, said Fred. Oh no, hang on. A bag of sweets had spilled out of Fred's pocket, and the contents were now rolling in every direction. Big, fat toffees in brightly colored wrappers. Fred scrambled around, cramming them back into his pocket, then gave the Dursleys a cheery wave, stepped forward, and walked right into the fire, saying, The burrow! Aunt Petunia gave a little shuddering gasp. There was a whooshing sound, and Fred vanished. Right then, George, said Mr. Weasley. You in the trunk. Harry helped George carry the trunk forward into the flames and turn it onto its end so that he could hold it better. Then, with a second whoosh, George had cried, The burrow! And vanished too. Ron, you next, said Mr. Weasley. See you, said Ron brightly to the Dursleys. He grinned broadly at Harry, then stepped into the fire, shouted, The burrow! And disappeared. Now Harry and Mr. Weasley remained alone. Well, bye then, Harry said to the Dursleys. They didn't say anything at all. Harry moved toward the fire, but just as he reached the edge of the hearth, Mr. Weasley put out a hand and held him back. He was looking at the Dursleys in amazement. Harry said goodbye to you, he said. Didn't you hear him? Doesn't matter, Harry muttered to Mr. Weasley. Honestly, I don't care. Mr. Weasley did not remove his hand from Harry's shoulder. You aren't going to see your nephew till next summer, he said to Uncle Vernon in mild indignation. Surely you're going to say goodbye. Uncle Vernon's face worked furiously. The idea of being taught consideration by a man who had just blasted away half his living room wall seemed to be causing him intense suffering. But Mr. Weasley's wand was still in his hand, and Uncle Vernon's tiny eyes darted to it once, before he said, very resentfully, Goodbye, then. See you, said Harry, putting one foot forward into the green flames, which felt pleasantly like warm breath. At that moment, however, a horrible gagging sound erupted behind him, and Aunt Petunia started to scream. Harry wheeled around. Dudley was no longer standing behind his parents. He was kneeling beside the coffee table, and he was gagging and sputtering on a foot-long, purple, slimy thing that was protruding from his mouth. One bewildered second later, Harry realized that the foot-long thing was Dudley's tongue, and that a brightly colored toffee wrapper lay on the floor before him. Aunt Petunia hurled herself onto the ground beside Dudley, seized the end of his swollen tongue, and attempted to wrench it out of his mouth. Unsurprisingly, Dudley yelled and sputtered worse than ever, trying to fight her off. Uncle Vernon was bellowing and waving his arms around, and Mr. Weasley had to shout to make himself heard. "Not to worry! I can sort him out!" he yelled, advancing on Dudley with his wand outstretched. But Aunt Petunia screamed worse than ever and threw herself on top of Dudley, shielding him from Mr. Weasley. "No, really," said Mr. Weasley desperately. "It's a simple process. It was the toffee. My son Fred, real practical joker, but it's only an engorgement charm. At least, I think it is. But I can correct it." But far from being reassured, the Dursleys became more panic-stricken. Aunt Petunia was sobbing hysterically, tugging Dudley's tongue as though determined to rip it out. Dudley appeared to be suffocating under the combined pressure of his mother and his tongue, and Uncle Vernon, who had lost control completely, seized a china figure from on top of the sideboard and threw it very hard at Mr. Weasley, who ducked, causing the ornament to shatter in the blasted fireplace. "Now, really," said Mr. Weasley angrily, brandishing his wand. "I'm trying to help." Bellowing like a wounded hippo, Uncle Vernon snatched up another ornament. "Harry, go! Just go!" Mr. Weasley shouted, his wand on Uncle Vernon. "I'll sort this out." Harry didn't want to miss the fun, but Uncle Vernon's second ornament narrowly missed his left ear, and on balance, he thought it best to leave the situation to Mr. Weasley. He stepped into the fire, looking over his shoulder as he said, "The burrow!" His last fleeting glimpse of the living room was of Mr. Weasley blasting a third ornament out of Uncle Vernon's hand with his wand, Aunt Petunia screaming and lying on top of Dudley, and Dudley's tongue lolling around like a great slimy python. But next moment, Harry had begun to spin very fast, and the Dursleys' living room was whipped out of sight in a rush of emerald green flames. Okay, I'm going to stop there today, because the next chapter is not super short, and there's not a good break in between. So, have a great Monday, and come back tomorrow, and we'll keep going.